In the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh!, spell cards provided some of the most powerful effects in the game. They shaped entire decks and have strategies built around them. And in this video, we're going to go over some of the best continuous spells from the classic era, which we describe as just the time period before Synchro monsters came out. Would you like Kashtira's zone blocking effects in the classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Without bringing Kashtira? Well, look no further than our number 10 spot with the best classic continuous spells, Ground Collapse. This continuous spell card has the effect that once activated, you select 2 main monster zones on the field, and those 2 selected main monster zones cannot be occupied by a monster. Few cards in general tend to lock zones, especially in classic Yu-Gi-Oh! And depriving your opponent of an important resource like a monster card zone can find some usage. However, in reality within classic Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's pretty rare that your opponent will need all their monster zones. Classic is just a lot slower than modern. Aggro decks typically focus on archetypal beatdowns, or aggro decks like Beast or Chaos. Most extenders are searchers rather than special summons, and battle traps are back and see constant play. So suffice to say, Ground Collapse isn't the best card on this list. But the competition with other continuous spells in classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Aren't really that much better. However, in tandem with some other cards, Ground Collapse can work. It's been a good tool for controlled lockdown strategies like Spatial Collapse Lockdown, which is a significant improvement and expands on Ground Collapse's effect. This continuous trap card can only be activated if both you and your opponent have 5 or less cards on the field. And what it does is prevent both players from exceeding having 5 cards on their side of the field. So, with the duo of Ground Collapse and Spatial Collapse with Ojama Trio's effect to summon tokens to your opponent's side of the field, you can lock out all of your opponent's monster zones, preventing them from essentially playing the game and only having 2 spell trap card zones, where eventually you can deck out your opponent by just waiting around long enough with a single copy of Outstanding Dogmaron in your deck, so you don't deck out first. And at number 9, we have a complement to Floodgates, Mass Driver. This continuous spell card is infamously known for enabling some insane OTKs and FTKs strategies through its effect, which allow you to tribute 1 monster on your side of the field to deal 400 damage to your opponent's life points. Without a once per turn limit on the damage or amount of tributes, Mass Driver is one of the most abusable cards, with it being a key component in tons of burn FTK strategies. Thankfully, in the TCG where Mass Driver is truly abusable, it's banned. The most well-known use of its abuse was with the infamous Frog Burn OTK. But we're talking about classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Here, where the card isn't banned, and it's significantly harder to make use of its not once per turn effect. But don't let that fool you, as there is actually a Mass Driver OTK in classic Yu-Gi-Oh! As well. There is a specific Mass Driver FTK deck that uses a combination of Mass Driver, Dark Magician of Chaos's effect to add back spells from graveyard to hand on summon, as well as at banishing when it leaves the field, Dimension Fusion, which is a monster reborn but for banished monsters, and Spell Economics, which lets you not pay life points for spell cards. So essentially what would happen is that Spell Economics would make Dimension Fusion's 2,000 life point cost to bring back banished monsters free. So by bringing back Dark Magician of Chaos, you can get your Dimension Fusion back for free, and then tribute Dark Magician with Mass Driver's effect, and just continue until you FTK your opponent. There's even a trap card counterpart called Type 0 Badger Crusher, which has the same effect but for spell cards and sending from your hand instead from the field, which is significantly harder to capitalize on despite having the same effect. Fortunately, in classic Yu-Gi-Oh!, infinite loops are quite the rare sight due to the limited card pool, and in almost all cases, it's not worth tributing your monster to deal a low 400 damage to your opponent unless you can infinitely loop the effect. So it's hard to fully capitalize on the strength of Mass Driver, which is why it's only at number 9. Moving on to number 8, we have the continuous spell Chain Energy. This spell card is an intense floodgate of sorts, as it adds attacks to each player for 500 life points whenever they normal summon, special summon, set, or activate cards from their hand. Chain Energy isn't the typical negating floodgate. Rather, it's one that adds a cost onto anything your opponent can do, which in some cases is even better. At first glance, 500 damage doesn't seem like a lot, but remember, this applies to any summon or activation of a card in the hand, which can build up insanely quickly. Chain Energy outputs a lot of early damage onto your opponent when they're starting to establish a board in the slower classic Yu-Gi-Oh! In modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, players could easily wipe out their own life points by just going full combo. But then again, the modern format has a ton of tools to deal with random spell and trap cards. However, the same can't be said about the classic era of Yu-Gi-Oh!, as spell and trap card removal wasn't as common. There's a few options that have little or no cost, like Mystical Space Typhoon and Heavy Storm, but they're both limited to 1 copy, with Harpy's Feather Duster even being banned. Regardless, Chain Energy is a double-edged sword. The Chain Energy tax applies to both players, so players who run Chain Energy can have their strategy backfire. Chain Energy serves as a card to limit your opponent's plays as much as possible, which is why it's popular in the Heavy Slump deck, which fills your opponent's hand with enough cards to activate the Heavy Slump trap card, which if they have 8 or more cards in the hand, They shuffle their hand to the deck and draw 2 cards. From there, your opponent has significantly less options to play. And even if they do play, they'll be taking burn damage from Chain Energy. Chain Energy serves quite the complementary role in burn decks alongside the likes of Wave Motion Cannon, Just Desserts, and Ceasefire for additional burn damage. And at number 7, we have Card of Safe Return. This card has the effect that when a monster is special summoned from the grave, you can draw 1 card. Despite its simple effect, Card of Safe Return is banned in modern TCG format for its effect. Although it's significantly more frequent to special summon from the graveyard in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, there's only like a staple or 2 that special summons from the graveyard in classic Yu-Gi-Oh! So with a Card of Safe Return, it's a free advantage. And some decks really capitalize on the advantage that a Card of Safe Return can provide. A lot of people remember Card of Safe Return being used in the anime when the effect backfired against Strings in his duel against Yugi, as Strings had to draw through his entire deck due to an Infinite Loop or Revival Jams effect in tandem with Slifer the Sky Dragon's effect. For example, Card of Safe Return is used in conjunction with Ectoplasmer and Malice Doll of Demise. Ectoplasmer is another continuous spell that has the effect that once at the end phase of the player's turn, the player must tribute 1 face-up monster and inflict damage to their opponent equal to half the original attack of the monster, combined with Malice Doll of Demise, which has the effect that during the next standby phase after this card was sent from the field to the graveyard by the effect of specifically a continuous spell card, you can special summon the doll from the graveyard. So with Card of Safe Return's effect, you can easily draw an extra card each turn. Despite the most common Reborn spell, Monster Reborn, being banned in this format, there are still a ton of other cards that decks can utilize to take advantage of Card of Safe Return. However, classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Does not have that many tools for common use of Card of Safe Return, which is why it isn't so high on this list. And at number 6, we have the continuous spell Stumbling. This floodgate has the effect that when any monster is normal summoned, flip summoned, or special summoned, they're changed to defense position. Similar to the previous entry in this list to Chain Energy, Stumbling is not a negating floodgate, but still packs a strong effect. Stumbling essentially provides a free safe turn so that your opponent can't push directly for advantage. However, that applies to both players. It's similar to Magic the Gathering Summoning Sickness, where when a creature enters the field, they can't attack nor activate their effects. However, with Stumbling effects, monster effects can still be activated. Regardless, Stumbling has proved to be a great tool for control lockdown decks, which aim to control your opponent's actions as much as possible. It's most popular in the Clown Control deck, which utilizes cards like Stumbling and Labyrinth of Nightmare, in conjunction with Dream Clown and Blade Rabbit to destroy monsters. Following suit is the Ticking Time Bomb Wave Motion Cannon. This continuous spell card has the effect that during your main phase, you can send Wave Motion Cannon to the graveyard to inflict 1000 damage to your opponent for each of your standby phases that has passed since the card was activated. So essentially, if you stall out for 8 of your turns, you can win the duel in most cases. But coupled with any attacks you do to your opponent, you don't need to wait the full 8 turns. Wave Motion Cannon sees a fair amount of use in the slower classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Format, as it serves as a great tool in control decks to deal out large bursts of damage. As most control decks tend to limit and slow down the game even more, achieving 8 turns or less, depending on what kind of deck you're using, becomes easier and easier. Not to mention the limited number of back row removal options that exist in the format. From Jam Revival Control to Last Warrior Control, Wave Motion Cannon is a stable deck. Few decks, if any, run a singular copy of the card. It's almost always at 3 copies, especially since there is no limit to the effect activation, meaning you can have 3 Wave Motion Cannons fire at the same time if you manage to draw them. And at number 4, we have the old school discount Mystic Mine, the continuous spell card Kaiser Colosseum. This spell card has the effect that if there's 1 or more monsters on the field of the controller of this card, their opponent cannot place monsters on their side of the field if the number of monsters would exceed the number of monsters of the controller of this card. So in other words, your opponent cannot exceed the amount of monsters that you control. If you control 1 monster, then your opponent can't have more than 1 monster on the field. Kaiser Colosseum is an oppressive floodgate that few decks can truly make good use of due to its effect. As to fully capitalize on it, you need to be able to lock down the game with only 1 monster and keep said monster in a protected position. Despite how hard that sounds, it's actually a lot easier said than done. There are several control decks that capitalize on the Colosseum's oppressive nature as a great tool to control your opponents, as locking them down into 1 or 2 monster zones can easily shut down a multitude of decks. Decks typically have 1 survivable boss monster to beat down your opponent while under the effect of Colosseum. A fun usage of Kaiser Colosseum is with another card on our list, Ground Collapse. In a deck that features both these cards, the deck aims to lock your opponent out of using monster zones with cards like Ground Collapse, Kaiser Colosseum, Spatial Collapse, and Ojama Trio. However, like all the aforementioned floodgates, and even more so with Kaiser Colosseum, the card loses a lot of its value the more populated your board is. And at number 3 is our last floodgate in this list, Level Limit Area B. This spell card has a deceptively simple effect to change all level 4 or higher monsters to defense position. Level Limit Area B is arguably the most popular continuous spell card the classic Yu-Gi-Oh has, as it enables a ton of different strategies. In a format where boss monsters are typically high-level effect monsters, Level Limit Area B essentially stops them in their tracks. This paves the way for low-level monster strategies to thrive, and there are a ton. Like most floodgates, this card thrives in control strategies, specifically and obviously with low-level monsters. From Raging Flame Sprite equipped with the several equip cards to stall out the game with Final Countdown to the infamous Pac-Man decks, Level Limit Area B is a staple for lockdown decks in general. The most iconic deck, the Pac-Man deck, which stands for Pure Advantage Camels Munch All Noobs, and essentially the deck relies on desert-themed flip monsters like Des Lacunda, Medusa Worm, Swarm of Locusts, and Swarm of Scarabs to essentially starve your opponent out of their resources, as each of the main monsters can flip themselves back down. Coupled with the protection of Level Limit Area B and its trap counterpart Gravity Bind, opponents would feel the heat of the desert and lose. If Level Limit Area B exists, doesn't that mean there should be a Level Limit Area A as well? Well, it does, but it's significantly less notable as its counterpart. Level Limit Area A is a continuous trap card that features almost the same artwork and has the effect to change all face-up level 3 or lower monsters to face-up attack position. So, suffice to say, not the most playable card, as few strategies, if any, would rely on Level Limit Area A. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh, Crossout Designator is one of the more popular anti-hand trap cards for its effect to remove a specific card from the deck to negate cards of the same name. In classic Yu-Gi-Oh, there's a similar card with a more permanent solution, and I'm not talking about taking your opponent's deck and removing the card yourself. I'm talking about our number 2 spot, Prohibition. This spell card, once activated, you declare a card name. The card's effects can't be used. However, that doesn't apply to cards that are on the field, including if they are face down. But regardless, it serves as more of a permanent, continuous version of Prohibition. The strength of Prohibition comes in its versatility. Like any format, there are staples that every deck uses. To completely shut down these staples that every deck uses is invaluable. Even outside of staples, in a multiple game setting and you know your opponent's key combo pieces or the boss monster, you can just shut them down then and there as long as you keep Prohibition on the field. The only downside is that you need to keep Prohibition on the field to maintain the ban. And unlike this seemingly stronger and modern version of the card Crossout Designator, you don't need to have a copy of the card to remove your deck. You can specifically target cards your opponent uses. For example, if your opponent uses a Chaos Sorcerer deck, you can declare that card as a targeted card for Prohibition, and that shuts down their main boss monster, and unless they have spell or trap card removal outside the one copy Mystical Space Typhoon, then they're in trouble. Regardless, Prohibition, in the slower pace of classic Yu-Gi-Oh, is insanely strong for its ability to preemptively disrupt your opponent's key cards, especially in games 2 and 3. Pond of Greed is infamously known for being one of the best cards ever printed for the free advantage it provides you. Mirage of Nightmare is another card that is on a similar level of strength. See, Mirage of Nightmare is a continuous spell card that has the effect that once per turn during your opponent's standby phase, you draw until you have 4 cards in your hand. Then if you do, during your next standby phase, randomly discard the same number of cards you drew. So if you get rid of your hand during your turn, you can draw 4 more cards, but at the cost of discarding 4 cards later on. Drawing cards and accessing more of your deck is always beneficial, as you can get more key cards or just resources in general. Even in classic Yu-Gi-Oh, there are plenty of decks that gain advantage or have specific effect triggers when certain cards are in the graveyard, and Mirage of Nightmare enables those kinds of decks to an extent. Another common usage of Mirage of Nightmare is with cards that either get rid of Mirage of Nightmare, as in spell trap card removal, or emergency provisions. These examples are the most common combo culprits with Mirage. See, lots of players would destroy Mirage of Nightmare before the cost of discarding cards to take place, giving them a draw 4 for free as there's no lingering effect even if Mirage leaves the field. Not to mention its synergy with the ever popular Emergency Provisions Quick Play spell card, which allows you to send any number of your other spell and trap cards you control to the graveyard to gain 1,000 life points for each card sent to the graveyard in this way. So on top of drawing up to 4, you would get rid of Mirage of Nightmare to gain life points on top of it. Thankfully, Mirage of Nightmare is banned and won't see the light of day for a long time.